From Saul to Paul, how God transforms the worst among us, according to the Bible. He was feared, respected, obsessively devoted to what he believed was right. And yet, in the eyes of God, Saul of Tarsus was a man walking in complete darkness, blind long before the light ever struck him on the road to Damascus. He wasn't misunderstood. He wasn't merely misled. He was, by his own later admission, the worst. A persecutor of the church, a man who stood by as the innocent were murdered in the name of religion. Saul wasn't lost because he didn't care. He was lost because he thought he was right, and yet he became Paul. This isn't just a story of change. It's a story of total transformation. Not behavior modification, not religious redirection. Transformation. The kind that only God can do. The kind where the past isn't rewritten, but it is redeemed. The kind where a man once fueled by rage becomes the most powerful voice of grace the early church would ever know. There's a reason the story of Saul turning into Paul still echoes thousands of years later. Because deep down, many of us wonder, can God really use someone like me? After all I've done? After all the ways I've run, resisted, or rebelled? That's why this story matters. Because if God could reach into the heart of a man like Saul, stop him mid-mission, speak his name from heaven, blind him just long enough to help him see, then there's no one beyond hope. No sin too dark, no soul too stubborn, no path too twisted. This isn't just about who Saul was. It's about who God is. A God who sees beyond who you've been and speaks to who you could be. A God who doesn't flinch at your failures. A God who isn't intimidated by your rebellion. A God who loves deeply enough to interrupt your life, even if it means breaking you to rebuild you. So maybe you feel like the worst. Maybe the shame runs deep, the regret too loud, the years too far gone. But this story, this man, this transformation, it's a reminder that God still transforms the worst among us. And maybe, just maybe, that includes you. Let's walk the road together, from Saul to Paul. Before Paul wrote letters that shaped the early church, he wrote arrest warrants. Before he preached about grace, he embodied fury. Saul of Tarsus wasn't a man quietly disagreeing with Christians. He was a man hunting them, relentless, devout, dangerous, and convinced with all his heart that he was doing the will of God. He wasn't a street rebel or a careless villain. He was a Pharisee, brilliant, respected, trained under Gamaliel, one of the greatest Jewish teachers of the time. Saul had everything going for him: intellect, pedigree, purpose. But his purpose was poison. He believed that this new Jesus movement was heresy, a threat, an offense, and he was determined to crush it. Acts 8 says that Saul was ravaging the church, entering house after house, dragging off men and women and committing them to prison. Think about that. He didn't just oppose Christians, he pursued them. He tore families apart. He stood approvingly as Stephen, the first Christian martyr, was stoned to death, watching with folded arms as blood spilled on the ground. He was, in every sense, an enemy, not just of the church, but of grace. That's what makes his story so breathtaking. Because when God chooses to show us what redemption looks like, he doesn't pick the slightly broken, he picks the one no one believes could be redeemed. This is important. Saul thought he was fighting for God, but in reality, he was fighting against him. He had truth in his mouth, but death in his heart. And it reminds us, zeal without love becomes violence. Religion without relationship becomes weaponized. That's who Saul was, a man convinced he was holy but whose hands were covered in the scars of others. So why would God choose him? Because that's what grace does. It reaches to the furthest edge. It steps into the heart of the most unlikely. It takes the man least deserving and says, "I'm not finished with you yet." Saul was the worst-case scenario, and that's exactly where God wanted to start. It was just another day for Saul. Another journey, another mission to arrest and imprison more Christians. He had the papers. He had the authority. He had the fury. He was, in his own mind, doing holy work. But somewhere on that dusty road to Damascus, everything changed. A light, a voice, a question. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" In that single sentence, heaven collided with earth. God didn't send a warning. He sent himself. Jesus didn't show up in anger. He showed up in intimacy, calling Saul by name. Twice, like a father waking a frightened child, like a shepherd calling a lost sheep. And the question? It wasn't rhetorical. It was surgical. Why are you doing this? Not just why are you hurting people, but why are you hurting me? Because to touch the church is to touch Christ himself. And in that moment, Saul didn't just see a blinding light. He saw the devastating weight of his wrongness, of how far off he'd been. He had thought he was righteous. He discovered he was blind. This is how God interrupts a life. Not gently, not vaguely, but clearly, directly, with conviction and compassion rolled into one holy collision. He doesn't wait until we're ready. He steps into the middle of our mess. He shouts our name until we fall off the horse. And even then, he catches us with grace. Saul went blind. His vision was stripped so that he could see clearly for the first time. He had spent his whole life reading the law, and now the lawgiver was standing in front of him. And in that collision, Saul's world shattered. Everything he had built, status, certainty, control, gone in a flash. And yet, it was the beginning of his healing. Maybe that's where you are now. Maybe your life hasn't gone off course. It's being interrupted. Maybe the light that feels like it's blinding you is actually God opening your eyes. Maybe the question echoing in your soul isn't a rebuke, it's an invitation. God doesn't just change lives at the altar, He changes them on the road. In motion, on the way to destruction. That's grace. It meets you mid-stride. It knocks you down, not to hurt you, but to humble you. And then it says, "Get up, I've chosen you for more than this." When the light faded, Saul was blind. But it wasn't just his eyes that had been shut. It was his old life. Everything he thought he knew had been burned to the ground in the presence of Jesus. The man who once walked confidently now stumbled, led by the very hands that once seized others. The hunter became helpless. For 3 days Saul sat in the dark. He didn't eat, he didn't drink, he didn't run. He waited. This wasn't punishment, it was preparation. God wasn't done with Saul. He was just beginning. But before he could give him a new name, he had to let the old one die. We don't like this part of the journey. The silence, the stillness, the sense that nothing is happening. But in Scripture and in life, the greatest transformations often happen when God seems most silent. Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the fish. Jesus spent 3 days in the tomb. Saul spent 3 days in total blindness. Because something in us has to be buried before resurrection can begin. Imagine what Saul wrestled with in that darkness. The faces of those he hurt, the sound of Stephen's prayer echoing in his ears, the shame, the weight, the unraveling of his identity. God wasn't simply changing Saul's mission, He was changing Saul. This is the part of grace we don't talk about enough. The breaking, the undoing, the slow, holy ache of becoming someone new. Some of you may be in a 3-day season right now. Not literally, but spiritually. You feel stuck, silent, forgotten. But maybe, just maybe, God is not delaying. He's dissolving what was never meant to last. He's ending the old so that the new can rise. Saul entered those 3 days as the church's most feared enemy, but he would come out of them as heaven's chosen messenger. Because the darkness doesn't mean God has left. Sometimes the darkness means God is doing something too deep to be rushed. And sometimes going blind is the only way we finally learn how to see. God could have healed Saul directly. He could have spoken from the heavens again or sent an angel, but he didn't. He sent Ananias, a simple, faithful man. Not an apostle, not a church planter, just a disciple. Quiet, obedient, and probably terrified. When God spoke to Ananias in a vision and told him to go lay hands on Saul, you can hear the hesitation in his voice. "Lord, I've heard about this man. He's done great harm to your people." And let's be honest, who could blame him? Saul's name struck fear like wildfire through the early church. Ananias didn't just doubt God's instruction, He was trying to survive, and now God was asking him to walk right into the lion's den. But God's answer was clear: "Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine." Imagine the tension in Ananias' chest as he walked toward that house. Every step was a battle between fear and obedience. Every corner he turned could have led him to death, but he kept walking, because grace sometimes asks us to embrace what we fear most. And when Ananias entered that room, he didn't call Saul a monster. He didn't remind him of his sins. He didn't accuse or condemn. He called him brother. "Brother Saul," he said, "the Lord Jesus has sent me so that you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit." That's what grace looks like. It speaks healing over the unworthy. It walks into the rooms no one else dares enter. It believes in the one who once destroyed everything. And the moment Ananias laid hands on him, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes. His sight returned. But more than that, his calling awakened. Never underestimate the power of the obedient few. Ananias will never be as famous as Paul, but Paul's story wouldn't exist without him. You and I, we are often someone's Ananias. We are the bridge between who someone was and who God is calling them to be. We are the ones who must sometimes face our fear in order to deliver the message of grace. Because when God transforms a soul, he usually sends someone else to carry the key. When Saul finally rose from the ashes of his old identity, he didn't just adopt a new name. He stepped into a whole new mission. From that moment forward, he was Paul, the same man in body, but a radically different man in purpose. The hunter of Christians became their brother. The enemy of the gospel became its loudest voice. The man who once arrested believers became the one who would never stop running toward them with the message of grace. And yet, Paul's new life wasn't easy. It was costly. From the beginning, his transformation came with a price: suspicion from the church, persecution from his former allies, imprisonments, beatings, shipwrecks, loneliness, betrayal, misunderstanding. If we measure a successful life by comfort or applause, Paul's life would seem tragic. But Paul never measured his life that way. He wrote letters from prison cells that still transform lives today. He preached in synagogues and marketplaces and deserts. He stood before kings and crowds, always with the same message: Jesus Christ and Him crucified. More than half the New Testament bears his words. And yet Paul never once bragged about his credentials. He didn't flex his education or boast in his leadership. Over and over he called himself the chief of sinners, a man saved only by the grace of God. He never forgot who he had been, but he never let it define who he became. He didn't let his past limit his calling. He didn't let his pain prevent his mission, and he didn't let his chains silence his voice. In fact, Paul's greatest work was done in chains, because when the world tried to confine him, the Spirit expanded him. This is what grace does. It doesn't just rescue, it releases. It doesn't just forgive, it fills. Paul didn't simply become a new man. He became God's man, fully surrendered, fully committed, and utterly unashamed of the gospel that had knocked him off his horse and into the arms of mercy. Paul's story proves this. Your calling will cost you something, but nothing compares to the joy of knowing you were chosen by God Himself to carry His truth into a broken world. We hear the story of Saul becoming Paul and think that's incredible, but we forget. It's not just historical, it's personal. Because the truth is, every one of us has a little bit of Saul in our story. Maybe you weren't dragging Christians into prison. Maybe you didn't stand at the execution of a saint. But we've all had moments where we resisted God, moments where pride drove us, where blindness shaped our decisions, where anger, fear, or ignorance pushed us far from His will. We've all built lives on the wrong foundation at some point, and for many of us, like Saul, the break from who we were to who God is calling us to be won't be soft. It will feel like being knocked off a horse. It will feel like blindness. It will feel like dying. Because grace isn't always gentle, but it is always good. You might be thinking, I've gone too far on 2. I've done too much. So did Saul. That didn't stop Jesus. You might feel unworthy. Paul did too. He wrote about it constantly. And yet, he never let his unworthiness become his identity. Instead, he wore it as proof that God uses the weak to shame the strong. You might wonder if your past disqualifies you. But here's the truth. Your past doesn't disqualify you. It qualifies you to become a living testimony of redemption. God didn't save Paul because he was impressive. He saved him to show the world that no one is beyond the reach of mercy. Paul's story is our story because we're all being transformed, bit by bit, day by day, grace by grace. You may not have a blinding light moment, but if you've heard Jesus speak your name, if you felt the weight of who you were being lifted by who he is, then you've already started walking the same road. You're not who you were, and you're not yet who you'll become. But transformation is happening, and like Paul, you'll look back one day and say, I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. Transformation isn't a one-time event, it's a lifelong calling. And Paul didn't just preach the gospel, he became it. His life, his scars, his struggles, his story, they all testified to one thing, that Jesus Christ can change everything. You don't go from Saul to Paul just to have a better story. You go so that your life becomes a living, breathing message to the world that grace works. Paul didn't walk around pretending he never made mistakes. He was honest about his past, honest about his weaknesses, honest about his desperate need for Jesus. And it was that honesty that made his ministry powerful. He didn't lead from a pedestal. He led from the ground, where grace had found him. He said things like, I am the least of the apostles. I do not even deserve to be called an apostle. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. That's how the transformed speak. You don't need to be perfect to become the message. You need to be faithful, willing, open. You need to stop hiding your story and start living it in the light. Your past may make people raise their eyebrows, but your transformed life will make them raise their eyes to heaven. Because people don't need more polish, they need to see proof, and you are it. When Paul wrote his letters, he wasn't sitting in comfort. He was shipwrecked, beaten, alone. But his voice was never chained. His hope never silenced. Because he knew that his life wasn't about safety, it was about surrender. The same is true for you. You may never stand on a platform. You may never write a letter that's read around the world. But you have neighbors, children, co-workers, strangers watching your life. Let them see the gospel, not just in your words, but in your wounds. That's how we become the message. When we live unafraid of who we were, when we walk boldly in who we are, when we let our lives say what Paul's always did, I was lost, but now I'm found. God didn't choose Paul because he was clean. He chose him because he was willing to surrender, willing to let go, willing to be changed forever. And maybe right now God is choosing you. You don't have to have it all together. You don't need the right words or the right background. You don't need a resume full of goodness. You need a heart that says, I'm ready. Even if you're still trembling, even if you're still uncertain. The same Jesus who stopped Saul mid-stride is still walking roads today, still whispering names, still interrupting sin and rewriting stories, still turning the worst among us into voices of grace. So stop disqualifying yourself. Stop calling yourself what God has already redeemed. You may feel like Saul today, driven by fear, by ego, by pain, but the road is in front of you. The light is shining. The question is echoing. Why are you running? Grace is not far from you. It's not waiting for you to clean yourself up. It's meeting you right here, right now on this dusty road. And maybe, by the end of this road, you'll be someone new. Not because you earned it, because Jesus changes people, because Saul became Paul. And now, it's your turn.